Hi everybody, welcome back to Make, Do, and Mend, our weekly chat about different aspects of DIY, crafting, and sewing. This week, we're going to be diving into the world of seam finishes. I've been doing lots of sewing lately, and different projects have required different seam finishes, so I thought that would be a fun thing to share. So I have 4 different samples that I'm going to show you completed, and then I'll show you the step-by-step for how to achieve these. So just flip you around here so I can show you the 4 different examples that I have. This one is a flat felled seam, F-E-L-L-E-D, felled. This is something that you see a lot in jeans, and it's basically a really flat finish where you see 2 lines of stitching on the top side and you don't see any raw edges on the back side. So we'll go over that one step by step. This one here is one of the most common and definitely easiest ways of finishing a seam. And it is just to overcast the edge with a zigzag. You can also do this with a serger if that's something you have access to. We do have 2 sergers available for borrow in the Guelph Tool Library inventory. This is a French seam, so from the front looks pretty normal, and then on the back you can see that the raw edges are encased by these little folds here. And this last one is just a bias binding or a fold over binding on the edge. You see that a lot in quilts, but you also see it on the insides of garments that are unlined. Sometimes you see it in the insides of pants, and sometimes it's in things like jackets and shirts. So there's some pants that I'm working on now. Set you up here at the sewing machine. I'll try to give you the best vantage point that I can. And we'll start with the flat felled seam. So that's, again, this one here that has the 2 lines of top stitching. And I'm using black thread, so hopefully it'll show up well on each of these samples. So typically when you're sewing, you would start with your right sides, so your like outsides facing together. But with a flat felled seam, you're gonna start with your wrong sides together, like this. So your right sides are gonna be facing out. And it's just a straight stitch, and it's about a 3/8 of an inch or maybe even a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And just a straight line along whatever edge you're working on. And then the next step before you do any trimming is to press the seams. So take you over here to my ironing area. I like to always start with just pressing it with my fingers because it just kind of gives it a chance to kind of flatten out, and just hold the iron in place for a few seconds. You don't want to swish your iron around or anything, and you don't want to slide along the seam because you don't want to distort those stitches. And just once the other way. And once from the other side as well. And before we go back to any sewing, we have to get this folded under, but we don't want the bulk of this piece here. So just take your trusty sewing scissors and trim this down to about 1/8 of an inch. You want to leave some of the fabric there because you don't want to compromise the strength of your seam. If you were to trim it all the way down, as soon as there's any tension on that seam, it's going to pop. But you still want to leave that little 1/8 of an inch there. And then we also need to get this folded over. So you want to press this fold down first. And this you'll have to do like a little bit at a time, but still picking up your iron each time. Now, obviously most seams are going to be quite a bit bigger, so this would take a lot longer, but this is just a way of showing you these examples. Trim these threads out of the way just so they don't get caught in my machine. So now we have this fold here and press it one more time in place. And we can head back to the machine. And for this step, it's really helpful if your machine has a like movable needle position so that you can use the edge of your foot as a guide. So I know that I want my top stitching to be as close to that edge as possible. So I can move my needle from right to left on my machine, which you can do on most machines, but sometimes it's a little harder to find the setting for that. And drop my needle down and do a back stitch. And then just follow that edge as straight as possible without pushing or pulling the fabric. And there you go. That is a flat felled seam. So you can see the back. You just see the one line of stitching and the other line of stitching is encased inside, and you have no raw edges, and you get a nice sturdy seam as well, which is why it gets used on jeans a lot, because there's a lot of tension and a lot of potential for friction. So it helps that seam hold up really well over time. And the next one that I'll show you is a French seam. French seams are really nice when it's a really fine fabric and you don't want to do something like a zigzag because it could snag the fabric and it could kind of weaken the fabric a little bit. This, because a French seam keeps everything enclosed and there's not a ton of bulk, it works well with a lot of different fabrics. You see it a lot in things like dress shirts and like light and gauzy kind of overshirts and things. And it looks just like a normal seam from the front. And this is another one where you're going to be starting with wrong sides together. So this is the right side of the fabric and the wrong side is like this. And this one takes a little bit of math to figure out. You have to kind of add fractions because you're doing two seams. So the reduction comes in twice. So if your seam is, your seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, then you have to add up two seam allowances that will add up to 5/8 of an inch or thereabouts. So it can take a little bit of figuring if it's not already factored into your pattern. But I'm going to start with a 1/2 inch seam, which will get trimmed down, but I wouldn't recommend starting your seam. My needle position needs to get moved back. That's my fault. Because otherwise that won't actually be a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch because my needle is moved. There we go. That's a 1/2 inch. So that's my 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then this will get trimmed down to 1/8 of an inch. The reason that you start with a wider seam allowance and trim it down is you have a lot more control when there's a wider seam allowance. And if you make an error, it's a lot easier to remove those stitches. But the closer you do your stitching to the edge, the more sort of risky it becomes. So I'm just gonna lightly press that down with my fingers and then take it over to the iron. Get a quick press this way. This one you don't need to press the seam open because it's just gonna get enclosed. With the flat fell seam, you want to press it open because it's getting flattened. So that's good. And then you're also going to press it folded. Helps to do that little finger press as well. And now we're going to go in and sew another line here to completely enclose this raw edge. Oh, sorry, took you out of frame there. So that's where that second fraction is coming in, because now we're further reducing this seam another little more than 1/8 but less than 1/4 of an inch, because if you went right to 1/8, you'd risk getting some of that other, some of that raw edge on the outside part of your seam, which you don't want. You can mark your seams with a pencil if you're more concerned as you're starting out with different seam finishes. And press it. The biggest, most time-consuming part of sewing, I would say, is pressing. It can take some time. And now that seam is completely enclosed, there's no raw edges sticking out, and you have a nice finished edge on both sides. And this one, just our basic zigzag stitch, I ended up with a bit of a well here. I think there was maybe a bit of an issue with my tension, so I'm going to try a different fabric on this one, because normally you'd want this to sit really, really flat. So hopefully on the next attempt it comes out a bit cleaner. But that's one where you're finally going to be starting with right sides together. So this will just have a standard 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is what's written into most patterns. And then just on personal preference, I'm going to trim that down to about 3/8 of an inch. And then press it. And you can overcast the edges individually, or you can group them together as I've done in this one. If you overcast them individually, it's nice because you can then press each seam to each side rather than having to choose which side you're going to press those seams over to. And I have it set to a zigzag stitch that is 6 millimeters wide and 2 millimeters long. Which will get it reasonably close to the edge without going over. And I'm having this trouble with it kind of eating my zigzag. I don't know if it's my tension or my feeding mechanism, because over the weekend I did probably like hours of zigzagging where it didn't do this. But it's just kind of yanking the fabric into the center. And I wish that it wasn't doing that because I'm showing you a new technique. So I'm going to stack them together just to give my poor feed dogs fighting chance. Because when there's 2 layers, it seems to feed quite a bit better. But anyway, there you go. It gives you more finished edge that'll prevent it from fraying. If you have pinking shears, you could also just do a pinked edge, which is that zigzag edge. But this will help with that fraying. It won't be able to go past that point. And then the last sample on the list is this bias binding, which is pretty easy to do. And it's just 2 steps really. So get this sample ready. And this is the bias binding. That's a double fold. So that means it folds in like this, and then it folds in like this. I always like to give it one more press before I start working with it, which can be quite tedious if you're doing something like a quilt, because there will be, 10 or more meters of binding all the way around the edge. And then I'm going to take this edge here. So line it up with the edge of your fabric, and this sort of well here where that press is, that's your stitching line with just a straight stitch. Also like to trim down this bulk once that's sewn, because this is going to encase all of these layers, and if there's multiple layers here as well as something like a quilt batting, that can create like a really kind of puffy edge. So if you don't want that, you can trim down your seam allowance. If it's something where you want that really crisp edge, then you can leave that seam allowance in. But in most cases, it would be a bit bulky. And then take it over here to give it another press. And from here, you can make the decision to either machine sew it, as I've done in this example, which would leave you with a seam on both, or a visible stitching line on both sides, or you can then go in and hand sew this seam closed by catching the inside of here and the top side of here, but it can be quite tedious, and unless you want a really sort of invisibly finished quilt or something, it's not entirely necessary to hand sew it, although it can be a kind of nice and meditative process if you're into that. I'm once again going to use my presser foot as my kind of guide and move my needle position to almost but not quite the very edge, because I want it to be able to catch on both sides. And normally got a little bit of a burr, something there, caught the threads. If you ever hear your machine doing something weird, a clunky noise or a grinding noise, always stop and investigate. Make sure that there's no threads caught anywhere, that like your needle's not out of alignment, it hasn't come unthreaded or something, because trying to like sew through a problem will likely lead to more problems. And that's our last sample. So you can see the stitching on both sides. With this one here, the white thread shows up a lot less. A peachy, pinky thread match would show up even less. So these sort of garish examples kind of show you the importance of either picking a really good thread match or kind of embracing the contrast of a bolder, sort of more stark thread. But I hope this was helpful for anyone who is new to sewing and was looking for some advice on different ways to finish seams. Whether it's for durability or for something aesthetic. Thanks for watching this week's episode of Make, Do, and Mend. Take care.